Some places are so beautiful that people don't just visit them. They fall in love with them. They move there chasing a different life, a slower life, a better life. But across America, many of the most beautiful towns share the same problem. The more people discover them, the harder they become to live in. These are the towns where the dream met reality. Asheville, North Carolina. Asheville was supposed to be the place artists could actually afford to live. Tucked into the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina, it had something rare, a genuine creative culture that hadn't been manufactured by a city marketing department. Potters and painters and musicians arrived in the 1990s and the early 2000s because rent was cheap, the mountains were extraordinary, and nobody was paying attention yet. That last part is the key. Because once people started paying attention, everything changed. The food scene got written up in national magazines, the River Arts District became a destination, Airbnb listings multiplied until whole neighborhoods that used to house working artists started housing tourists for long weekends instead. Asheville is now one of the least affordable small cities in the American South, a place where a modest house costs more than in many major metros, and where the people who built the creative culture that made the city worth visiting can no longer afford the rent. The artists didn't leave because they wanted to. They left because the city they made became too expensive for them to stay in. Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston is, by almost any measure, one of the most visually stunning cities in America. The pastel row houses of Rainbow Row, the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter. A food culture that has produced more James Beard Award winners per capita than almost anywhere in the country. There's a graciousness to the place, a slowness, a warmth that feels almost cinematic. But Charleston has always had a complicated relationship with who that beauty is actually for. The city's history is inseparable from its architecture, and the charm that draws millions of visitors each year sits directly on top of layers that don't make it into the tourism brochures. Understanding Charleston means holding both of those things at once, which is something the city itself has often been reluctant to do. For the tens of thousands of people who have moved to Charleston in the last decade, drawn by the beauty, the weather, the relatively low taxes, what many find is a city with deep and durable social hierarchies, a real estate market that has accelerated far beyond local incomes, and a sense that the real Charleston, the one behind the porches and the dinner parties, was always a closed circle. And they're standing just outside it, admiring the view. Santa Fe, New Mexico. Santa Fe sells a very specific version of itself, ancient, unhurried, spiritually serious. The adobe architecture is the color of the high desert. The plaza has been a gathering place for over 4 centuries. The light at dusk does something to the landscape that painters have been trying to capture for 100 years and mostly failing, which is itself part of the appeal. It also has one of the highest concentrations of art galleries per capita in the entire country, and most of those galleries are selling work that starts well into 5 figures. The median home price is pushed past $700,000 in a city whose local economy, built on tourism and government and a modest tech sector, cannot organically support that number. The people who can afford Santa Fe are largely people who made their money somewhere else and are now buying into a place that represents something, authenticity, history, a connection to the land, that their previous city couldn't offer. The irony is that this demand for authenticity is exactly what erodes it. Every wealthy buyer who arrives looking for the real Santa Fe makes it incrementally less real for the people who are already there. Sedona, Arizona. No American town has more aggressively marketed the idea of inner transformation than Sedona. The red rock formations are genuinely extraordinary. Cathedral Rock, Bell Rock, the spires of the Schnebly Hill Formation catching the late afternoon light in colors that feel impossible. The so-called vortexes, energy sites, believed by many to amplify healing and spiritual clarity, have built an entire retreat economy around people arriving with something broken and hoping to leave with it fixed. The problem is that Sedona has leaned so completely into the visitor economy that it has become almost entirely structured around people passing through. The permanent population is under 10,000. On a holiday weekend, traffic through the canyon can back up for miles. The wellness centers and crystal shops and sound bath studios now compete for the same space as the people who actually live there year-round, and the people who actually live there are increasingly losing that competition. Moving to Sedona to escape noise and find stillness is possible. It just requires a level of intentionality and a budget that filters out most people before they arrive. Boulder, Colorado. Boulder is what happens when a city optimizes so completely for one vision of the good life that it stops being a city and starts being a lifestyle product. more PhDs per capita than almost anywhere in the country. Trails out of the back door, a food and wellness scene that is, if you can afford it, genuinely world-class. The Flatirons as your daily backdrop. It's not an accident. Boulder has made deliberate policy choices for decades to protect its character, limit development, and maintain the quality of life that makes it worth living in. Those same choices have also made it one of the most expensive cities in America. More expensive than Seattle, more expensive than Chicago. The median home price sits above $1 million in a city that isn't a financial capital and doesn't have the salaries to match. The people who live there are disproportionately either tenured professors, tech workers who can work remotely, trust fund recipients, or people who bought a long time ago and are now sitting on an asset they couldn't afford to purchase today. Boulder has perfected the ideal life. It's just that the ideal life has a very short guest list. Savannah, Georgia. Savannah might be the most immediately beautiful city in the American South. The 22 historic squares, each one a small park anchoring the grid of the city, give it a walkability and a human scale that most American cities destroyed in the mid-20th century and have spent the last 30 years trying to rebuild. The architecture is extraordinary. The Spanish moss does something to the light that makes the whole city feel slightly suspended in time. It's also become one of the most aggressively tourist-saturated cities in the country. The ghost tours run every night, multiple companies, multiple routes. Downtown on a Saturday has the energy of a theme park. Bachelorette parties have become such a dominant feature of the city's identity that locals have a whole vocabulary for navigating around them. The bars on River Street are, by common agreement among people who live there, mostly for people who don't. The people who actually live in Savannah love it with a fierce loyalty. But they also spend a lot of time explaining that there's a real city here, neighborhoods with actual residents, a university that gives it genuine intellectual energy, a Black cultural history that is central rather than peripheral, and that it exists mostly beyond the squares, if you're willing to look for it. Key West, Florida. Key West has always been the end of the road, literally. The last island in a chain that runs out of land in the Florida Straits, 90 miles from Cuba, and a long way, psychologically, from anywhere that feels like normal America. It built its entire identity around people who needed to get as far from conventional life as the continental United States would allow. Writers came for the light and the isolation. Fishermen came for obvious reasons. Artists came because rent was cheap and judgment was suspended. People who had run out of road everywhere else came because Key West was the place where running out of road felt like freedom rather than failure. That identity is still visible, if you look for it. But it's now buried under a real estate market that has some of the highest prices in all of Florida. A short-term rental economy that has converted enormous portions of the residential housing stock into hotel rooms, and a tourism infrastructure built to serve the 4 million people who visit every year rather than the 25,000 who actually live there. The fishermen and the writers and the eccentrics who made Key West mythic mostly can't afford to stay. What's left is the myth, which turns out to be very lucrative, and the people who can afford to buy into it. You can still feel the old Key West if you know where to look. It's just that it now costs several $100s a night to sleep near it. Chattanooga, Tennessee. Chattanooga doesn't have the mythic reputation of the other cities on this list. It's not a bucket list destination. It doesn't have a literary legacy or a spiritual brand or a national magazine cover from the 1990s that everyone still references. For most of the 20th century, it was better known for industrial pollution than for anything you'd want to move toward. What Chattanooga has instead is a track record of making unglamorous decisions before they became necessary. In 2010, it became one of the first cities in America to build a municipally owned gigabit fiber network, not because it was fashionable, but because city leadership understood that infrastructure was the foundation everything else would be built on. It invested in its riverfront before the riverfront was worth anything. It built out outdoor access, trails, climbing areas, the Tennessee Riverwalk, as a long-term investment in livability rather than a marketing move. The pressures of growth are starting to show in Chattanooga too. Rents have risen. The same gentrification dynamics that hollowed out other cities are visible here as well. But what Chattanooga did differently was think about what kind of city it wanted to become before the attention arrived, which meant it had more tools to shape the growth rather than just absorb it. Every city on this list is genuinely beautiful. That part is not in dispute. The question is what beauty costs, and who, over time, gets to remain near it. The pattern repeats with enough consistency that it starts to feel like a law. A place develops something real, a creative culture, a connection to the landscape, A way of life that feels specific and human and worth something. Word gets out. People arrive wanting a piece of it. The cost of proximity to that thing starts rising faster than the thing itself can sustain. And eventually, the people who built it, the artists, the fishermen, the musicians, the eccentrics, are the people who can no longer afford to stay. None of this is simple. The people who move to these cities aren't villains. They're doing exactly what the culture told them to do. Find a beautiful place, put down roots, build a life. The problem isn't individual choices. It's a structural failure to protect the conditions that made these places worth moving to in the first place. The dream of living somewhere beautiful is real. The desire to slow down, to be somewhere specific, to wake up in a place that feels like it means something, that's not an illusion. It's just that acting on it has consequences that compound in ways nobody fully accounts for when they're standing in a mountain town doing the math on what rent might cost.